We've heard the opposition pretty critical of the minister. Is it primarily an Optus issue, though, first and foremost, particularly in the days just immediately after?
Cybersecurity is a shared responsibility. It's a whole-of-nation effort. It requires both government and the private sector to work very closely together to mitigate and combat the very serious threats that we face. Private companies alone can't defeat these threats. Government can't defeat these threats if they don't have cooperation of the private sector. So both the minister and the company have really important responsibilities.
All right, we're waiting to hear from the minister. We think it'll be soon. She's still welcome to come on the program. But what about the hack itself? One troubling thing is, and this is going off one reporter who's posted a report on it, but they seem to know their stuff, that it was data just available and wasn't even password protected. The CEO the other day on Sky wouldn't say whether or not passport information and driver's licence information was encrypted. She said, well, I can't give that away, it's sensitive information, just whether it is encrypted. Do those two facts worry you?
Oh, just on your first point, Tom, it would be good if we heard from the minister today, because it's now 5 days since the attack has occurred and the minister has given no interviews, has held no press conferences, has said nothing other than 3 tweets at 3/4 time of the grand final on Saturday.
At least by then the match was pretty much over.
Well, indeed, it certainly was. This is one of the largest cyber attacks in Australian history, and the cybersecurity minister, appointed by the Prime Minister to quite some fanfare in June, has said nothing publicly at all other than 3 tweets. I don't think that's good enough. On Optus, we still don't know, because Optus isn't saying and the government hasn't said yet, how this breach occurred and who is responsible. And it will be important that we understand that. I think a full timeline needs to be presented to the public.
And important because then you need to know whether this was a really sophisticated attack that's hard to thwart, or whether this is a really bad weakness from Optus that shouldn't have happened. But not being able to say whether passport numbers and driver's licence numbers are encrypted, surely they should, first of all, should be able to answer that, and second of all, the answer should be yes.
I'm certainly concerned, Tom, about some of the public reporting speculating about how this access might have occurred. If that is accurate, if it is true that this was an internet-facing API, that it was not password protected and that it was not encrypted, then that would be a very serious failing by Optus. But as I say, we don't yet know and we need that to be confirmed.
All right. Well, yeah, we'll wait for that further information. That's fair enough. And that does lead our mind, though, because I know the coalition is out there talking about more penalties for cyber criminals. They don't really respond to penalties. Isn't the bigger issue, let's have more penalties for companies if they're not doing the right thing, if they're not thorough enough with guarding this data? They're the ones that are going to, they want to be part of society. Cyber criminals don't.
Well, I think that's a fair point, Tom, and the truth is we need to do everything. We need penalties for criminals and penalties for companies. And actually, we've put some of the most significant obligations on private industry that we've ever had in Australian history in our critical infrastructure reforms. One package passed in December last year, another package passed in March, and that not only imposes the requirements on industry to do certain things to protect themselves, actually gives the Minister for Home Affairs special powers to impose on a subset of highly significant systems of national significance extra obligations. It's not clear whether the Minister has done so. If she has, I hope she says so today.
Okay, but from your understanding, from what the coalition brought in, what would be the biggest penalty Optus could face for this?
Well, that's a good question. Let's wait and see. It depends on the nature of the breach and the nature of Optus's, the way they've handled it. And it also depends whether or not the government has indeed switched on those obligations that we put in law. So there's 2. There's the systems of national significance that I mentioned, but there's also an obligation, positive security obligations, that companies like Optus have to take the steps that they need to protect themselves. And I don't know whether the government has issued regulations for that process to be initiated. If they haven't, then it's possible that there'll be no penalties for Optus, but that would be because the government had failed to act.
So if Optus has been shown to not have proper things in check and the government's ratcheted things up to the nth degree that you spoke about, what penalty are we talking about then?
Well, we'll wait and see, Tom. We don't know.
So the other day we had an expert on that said, well, they might only have to pay a $44,000 fine. Presumably the worst that you're talking about there would be what, millions? Would it be people forced to leave the company? What are these worst possible punishments?
Tom, I don't think it's appropriate for me to publicly speculate about possible punishments when we don't even know what yet's happened. I think we do need those facts established first, and then we can see whether or not the legislation which passed would have applied in this instance, and whether or not the government has issued the necessary regulations to make sure those obligations exist. There's a couple of steps there that we need to get through.
But in any general sense, the biggest penalty available is well beyond just a $44,000 fine. for a huge company like this, presumably?
The answer is it depends, Tom. Depends on the circumstances.
Right, but the worst possible one, we'd have to be talking about millions, I'm assuming.
I'm not going to publicly speculate about potential consequences for a potential breach that we don't yet know the facts of.
Okay. Just finally, Joe Biden, for the fourth time, mentioned that the US would come to the defence of Taiwan if they were attacked by China. It seems to be a set policy now. What do you make of that? Is that a positive development?
Yeah, you and I have discussed this before, Tom, on this program. I think President Biden is sending a very clear signal to China that they shouldn't take any steps to force Taiwan to unify with the mainland because he's very concerned that China might do so.
Does it make us rethink our position, Australia's position? Should we think about a similar sort of statement?
I support Australia's policy of strategic ambiguity. I think that has survived the test of time. It's really demonstrated since 1972 when we officially recognised the government in Beijing as the government of China, that it's preserved both the status quo and peace and stability across the Taiwan Strait, which is our interest.
James Paterson, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Tom.